Renewal and fixing the country. These are two of the things ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa says his party will be paying attention to. Ending power cuts, creating jobs with help from the private sector and prioritising economic recovery are also top of the list. Let's unpack the ANC's January 8th statement with Development Economist Phelisa Nkomo. Phelisa, great to speak to you again. I spoke to you on Friday just before that January 8th statement, and now that's behind us, I'm sure you have had time, no doubt, to study that. Was it what you expected?
Good evening. No, I mean, I think it was actually what I expected, by the way, because what the president has actually presented is not entirely new. And I think he's been able to do this almost every year. But where, for example, the issue is, and I think South Africans we really need to ask is, we must ask the question, what's the implementation? Where is the implementation plan that underlies this? Of course, there are new issues that he raised, which I was quite impressed. I think the first issue, it's around establishing accountability mechanisms for ANC employees who are in public office and making sure that it holds them accountable from a performance perspective. That's the first issue. I think the second one, which was also quite new, was a recognition, in fact, that the political and the administrative interface of ministers and administrative staff in this context, the officials, would really need to be, the parameters would need to be established very clear, because you'd know that once the minister actually has a fallout, or a mayor has a fallout with the municipal manager, or with a minister with a DG, or an MEC with the head of department, more often than not, in fact, that has led into a state of paralysis in as far as delivery in those departments. But and I think the issues around, building state capacity, and I think that has been, an ongoing conversation. The other issue I think we also need to really, I thought, was important for him was, the mentioning of a prioritization of young people. We have 66% of young people who are busting at home, who are socially disengaged and economically unproductive. So there are a few things that were quite new, but I mean, overall, it's a diagnosis we've been sitting with, and I think as economics, I think we've said all the time. The only thing, though, I think the president would really like him to say, but it's embedded in the story when you read it, is the fact that South Africa is confronted with leadership crisis. Municipalities have actually, I mean, if you look at the data of public protests against, service delivery, for instance, they indicate fundamentally a crisis of leadership. So if you track that from, early as 2009 until to date, where communities will take to the street, they've even gone into as far as destroying public infrastructure, because they see public infrastructure as an instrument that actually represents a government within their own communities. So I wish he actually would have said that actually we confronted with leadership crisis. And the issue around potholes, the sewage system, and municipalities who can't pay, for services or pay for, their workers. And the fact that some, municipalities even use, the conditional grants, which are meant to be used for the very same infrastructure, they actually get used on salaries. So, so there are, few things that I think are kind of like quite encouraging, but the president has to recognize that we're not going to be able to keep South Africans into a hopeful state for too long, because that's what we've actually, every year in, year out, we've always been quite excited by the speeches, but with very much little execution on the ground.
Phelisa, I want to touch on this because I think it's interesting that you mentioned that you are happy that he talked about accountability mechanisms, especially at municipal level. And you mentioned also a crisis of leadership. Those two surely go hand in hand, though, in the sense that there have long been financial good practice standards, and perhaps I'm not using the correct terminology there, but those things exist to hold financial municipal managers to account. How is it that for so long, those measures that have been in place just haven't been followed up on or haven't been accurately deployed?
That's exactly, part of it has to do with weak political accountability systems, because it's it's not sufficient to have, you know, financial regulation to make it sure that public resources are managed very well. But you also need to be able to have additional steps from a political perspective where you know that your political deployees are actually adhere to the very public financial regulation regimes that have been established. So what we've seen over the years is really, you know, kind of like a chessboard going on where there's been non-compliance in between, you know, National Treasury would put the municipality under administration or the province, and then after that, you know, few years or few months later, the municipality, the mayor or the MM gets shifted and go and be deployed somewhere else, and someone else gets to replace that person. So, and part of it has to do as well with the fact that the political system has not really been strong enough to make it sure that, firstly, it looks at consequence management, and that there are embedded, you know, punitive measures that get used when, you know, there is some form of financial mismanagement. And even with the leadership crisis component, now you'd know that, and this is even applicable across, by the way, is that you'd know that, you know, leaders who emerge into the national political discourse of the ANC gets elected by local leaders. So there's always that, you know, implicit relationship where it's actually the mayors at a political level who gets to contribute and influence who then becomes the president. So in essence, that political, you know, organization on its own would also always means that there's always a gentleman's agreement. Because for president to be president today, he's been voted by a mayor, he's been voted by, you know, a ward councillor, he's been voted by an sitting MEC. So he also then, it means that in how he then gets to deal with them from a public governance perspective, then he's going to take it easy because they voted for him to be in power. So, you know, so that inherent constraints within our own political system, hence, you know, makes it difficult, you know, for even citizens to be able to hold those in public office accountable. Hence, several people have been calling for constituency-based system of voting, but also that in actually, you know, those who get to vote for the ANC during national elections, in fact, must be allowed to actually vote, you know, during the national elections. In that way, you give a voice to all, you know, members who are members of the ANC. But there's something else as well, of course, that I think, you know, the speech did recognize, is the issue around the climate change. I think we know what's going on in KZN right now. But, I mean, obviously, again, it's the whole issue about the call that has been made by a lot of social justice activists for a just transition and the need to have an open conversation around what type of climate change interventions that we should actually be undertaking. I know that the president has developed a framework on climate change, but it needs to be subject of public scrutiny, and we need to debate on whether that framework is actually suitable, you know, for citizens.
And we understand that a lot of these processes take time. It's not quite as easy as formulating a plan, developing that into a framework and then immediately implementing it. There needs to be public feedback. There needs to be questions about whether that indeed is the right way to go. And that's obviously also why we sit with problems of implementation and why a lot of these points recur on the January 8th statement year after year, is because implementation is hamstrung by so many of these processes. And I want to get to that in just a moment. But I first want to find out from you, where are we in that framework development process regarding the restructuring of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and what eventually would the impact be on ordinary South Africans? Because that's a topic that often sort of gets discussed by economists, but people on the street, you know, sometimes want to have that impact unpacked for them.
That's very interesting. In fact, one of the issues again around the Reserve Bank mandate, it's so important because it sits within the macroeconomic framework, which is intended or which works in tandem with fiscal policy. So amongst the key things that really happens here is that the fiscal policy really looks at allocation of resources, which gets collected through tax systems. The monetary policy is such an important instrument for the economy because amongst those is that it regulates, through its decisions, it regulates the cost of capital in the economy, but also indirectly, it kind of like then implicitly influence the movement of that capital in that, firstly, how do households access capital, and at what cost? How do businesses access capital, and of course, at what cost? So the issue of Reserve Bank mandate, it's such an important issue because we know that probably South Africa is the only country that has an inflation targeting mandate, but that is only a singular mandate. Most of the countries, I mean, even with the US, they have a dual mandate. They look at price stability and it looks at unemployment. Now, why these two variables are quite important is because both of them are kind of like interdependent. So we know that for you and I, for instance, every time there's an interest rate increases, what it means is that it creates what we call economic leakage. So all of a sudden you see everything else that is financed by the banks, it means that it's on the increase. So all of a sudden you're losing income that you worked for, but you get to that income is taken by the banks. That's the first issue. The second issue is it's around support, inflationary support, and I understand increases their interest rate because they need to do what it's called inflation management. They need to fulfill their inflation targeting. But the risk, of course, about primarily focusing on a singular, objective, monetary policy objective, which is this, the price stability, is that then it always had multiplier effects. The first one is that every time there's interest rate increases, businesses firstly see that as an increased cost of taking new credit, but also we know that most of the businesses actually are undertaken from, or they get their initial, capital outlay to run the businesses from their banks. So in essence, they see that again as an economic leakage as well. So can you see that there are two economic sectors that are actually directly affected? There's a third one, that the cost of interest rates get actually transferred into several goods within the economy. So when you go and buy bread, when you go and buy oil, when you go and buy inflation, etc. So naturally, we do experience, food inflation as soon as interest rate kind of like increase, because in essence, it means that, those who are in business and who are losing money as a result of increased interest rate, they'll have to transfer some of those costs into the goods. Now, the importance of including unemployment is to make it sure that the Reserve Bank actually, when it actually pulls the different strings around different monetary policy tools, that it does contribute in ensuring that in looking at an unemployment issue interchangeably with inflation targeting and, the state of the economy. Of course, all this, hence I said earlier that fiscal policy and monetary policy are actually quite interdependent. So hence they need to work together. Of course, every intervention that is undertaken by monetary policy, it needs support from fiscal policy, including national departments planning appropriately. So if, for example, you're talking about industrial development, right? Fiscal policy needs to provide sufficient funding to industrial development to make it sure that it actually creates jobs and that it supports some of what we call monetary policy intervention and fiscal policy. Same thing with agriculture. For example, we've seen, increased food prices. Amongst the key issues we need to really look at is to then say, what is the, agricultural output, but also how to make sure that we insulate household from food insecurity, which currently that's not the case. South Africa is a food secure country, but at a household level, it's insecure. And, at a face value, it might look as though, food insecurity is not linked to fiscal policy. It is linked because it requires sufficient resources, but also at the same time, it's linked as well to access to land where people are able to produce food for themselves. So in essence, the monetary policy and the need for the ANC to really make it sure that Reserve Bank has a dual mandate is actually long overdue. Because what it also forces the Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee is that every time they meet, they must always consider these two variables. Every time they think about increasing of interest rate, they must think about impact on unemployment. And they have that response. And currently, they are scot-free because they don't even discuss that. All they do is that they look at general numbers, statistics. If you look at their statement, they are always churning all sorts of statistics across the world, but very little about what is it that they think they need to do in contributing into unemployment. And obviously part of it is that they do require support from fiscals so that they are able to make it sure that their intervention from a monetary policy perspective, they are quite sustainable.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying that quite complex issue for us. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for this evening. But thanks for your contributions. That was Development Economist Phelisa Nkomo.